While the world watches tanks roll through Ukraine, another battle is quietly unfolding inside Russia. Beneath the surface of Putin's empire lies a fragile collection of regions, held together not by loyalty, but by fear. Now that false sense of unity is starting to crack. The war hasn't just drained Moscow's resources, it's exposed deep fault lines within. In places like Dagestan, whispers of dissent have grown into protests and open defiance. Several of Russia's regions are seeking independence, and the Kremlin faces a chilling possibility: losing up to 40% of its territory. Frankly, it's beginning to feel like the final days of the Soviet Union. As things stand, the real question isn't just about Ukraine anymore. It's whether Putin can stop his own country from falling apart. If you look past the parades and the propaganda that Putin is feeding to his people, you'll see a different kind of battlefield forming inside Russia. One that's not about tanks and borders, but about identity and people. Russia's separatist crisis isn't a new story. It's an old wound that's been ignored for too long, and now it's bleeding once again. What used to be a quiet problem tucked away in the history books is now breaking out into the open, spreading faster than the Kremlin can contain it. This buildup of decades' worth of resentment is exposing just how divided the country really is. Though it looks like one huge stretch of land on a map, Russia actually has 83 regions, and more than 20 of them are ethnic republics with their own languages, traditions, and strong memories of independence. For years, Moscow has managed to keep them quiet through a mix of fear, money, and force. But those methods are wearing thin. As Putin's political currency falls, people are no longer afraid to speak their language, show pride in their heritage, or demand fair treatment. And when the state tries to silence them, it only makes them louder and angrier. That's where the problems have been intensifying. Take Bashkortostan. Earlier this year, thousands of people flooded the streets of Ufa, chanting in Bashkir, after the arrest of Fail Aslianov, a local activist who defended the Bashkir language and identity. It wasn't a political protest, it was about dignity. But Moscow saw it as a threat. Riot police moved in, hundreds were arrested, and the internet went dark. The government managed to crush the protest, but the message spread far beyond Bashkortostan. The people are no longer staying silent. And Bashkortostan isn't alone. In Dagestan, anger runs even deeper. Since the start of the war, the region has seen hundreds of anti-draft protests. Local clerics have called the war unjust. Mothers have blocked roads to stop military buses. And young men are refusing to fight for a cause that they don't believe in. The Kremlin sent in the National Guard to restore order, but it hasn't worked. Dagestan now has one of the highest rates of draft evasion in the country. People there are tired of dying for someone else's war. Truthfully, you can almost feel the exhaustion in these places. That same frustration echoes in Buryatia, a small republic near Mongolia. It has fewer than 1 million people, but one of the highest death rates in the Ukraine war. Men from poor villages are being sent to the front lines in huge numbers, while Moscow's elites sit safely at home. Some of these villages have lost nearly all of their young men. Similar stories have come from Tuva, Kalmykia, and the North Caucasus regions, where poverty makes military service seem like the only way out. Recruiters promise good pay and medals, but deliver nothing but funerals. The reality is brutal. For every soldier lost in Moscow, dozens die from the republics. As the coffins come home, people are starting to ask the very obvious question: why are their sons dying for a war that isn't theirs? Why are they fighting to defend a government that doesn't even see them as equals? And the irony isn't lost on locals. They joke bitterly that their sons are ammunition for Russia. It's dark humor, but it says everything. The people no longer see themselves as citizens of a country, but as expendable parts of its war machine. Across these republics, this grief is turning into anger. It's no surprise that many are now openly questioning Moscow's authority. These protests aren't just about poverty or politics anymore. They're about something deeper. The feeling that Moscow doesn't just rule these regions, it drains them. You see, while the bodies go one way, the money flows the other. Russia's outer regions produce the oil, the gas, the diamonds, and the metals that keep the country running. But they see almost none of the profits. Yakutia, for example, produces nearly all of Russia's diamonds. The region is so resource-rich that it produces 15% of all the diamonds on Earth, according to the head of the Diamond Sorting Center. In 2024, its mines made over $4 billion. Yet the region's local budget got less than 2% of that. Meanwhile, schools are crumbling, hospitals lack supplies, and entire towns are sinking into poverty. It's the same story across Siberia and the Far East. Moscow takes everything and gives nothing back. People feel robbed and forgotten, watching their lands stripped bare while their communities decay. And that's the part that Moscow refuses to admit. Despite sucking up all these resources, life isn't any better for the average person. Right now, the country is facing more than 16,000 international sanctions, the most of any nation in modern history. Foreign investment has collapsed. Inflation has surged past 12%, and basic goods are getting harder to find. Fuel prices in Siberia have doubled. On top of all that, schools are closing because they can't afford heating, and hospitals can't even cover basic care. The economic problems also include earning power. Many Siberian towns depend on mining or timber, but wages are low while the prices keep climbing. In Yakutia, the average annual income is about $7,500, compared to over $25,000 in Moscow. That discrepancy is a big deal, but this goes deeper than money or the draft. It's about identity, about who people are and what they're allowed to be. Putin's government demands loyalty, but it also demands assimilation. After his 2018 education reforms, minority languages were pushed out of schools and replaced with lessons glorifying Ruski Mir, the so-called Russian word. Pride in local culture is treated as extremism, and activists defending their heritage risk being branded as terrorists. In Karelia, people are reviving Finnish. In Tatarstan, they're talking about bringing back the presidency that Putin abolished. Across the country, small acts of cultural defiance are growing into something bigger, a quiet rebellion. Even the day-to-day management of these regions has left them increasingly angry. Power in Russia is so centralized that even governors act like middle managers. Every major decision flows from Moscow. Regional parliaments exist, but they can't act independently. So when a flood hits Yakutia or drilling wipes out reindeer pastures in the Arctic North, local leaders can't respond without approval from the Kremlin. This results in a country that looks like a federation on paper, but feels more like an occupation in practice. When people are ignored long enough, they start asking dangerous questions. What if we ran things ourselves? That question has found a new audience online. Online, the Free Nations of Russia Forum has connected activists from all over the republics. They're not just asking for more autonomy, they're imagining life without Moscow altogether. Young Russians in Dagestan, Bashkortostan, and Tatarstan scroll through Telegram, VK, and TikTok, seeing others talk openly about identity, culture, and independence. Exiled communities in Europe and Mongolia amplify those messages. A young Tuvan can now see how Mongolia practices its language and traditions and wonder why Moscow doesn't. That curiosity turns into anger, and that anger turns into action. What used to be a whisper is now a conversation that is spreading fast. The big difference compared to all the previous years is that this resentment now has a blueprint: Ukraine. For Russia's regions, watching a neighboring country about the size of Tatarstan stand up to Moscow has been pretty eye-opening. Ukraine's defiance proves that breaking free isn't a fantasy. It is possible. A smaller nation took on the Kremlin and didn't vanish. That image of resistance has planted a dangerous idea inside of Russia itself. If Ukraine can stand on its own, why can't we? That reality has the Kremlin shaking in its bare fur boots. Putin's answer to all of this complaining, pleading, and protesting is predictable: more police, more propaganda, and more blame on foreign interference. But this isn't coming from the West. It's coming from inside Russia itself. From mothers who had to bury their sons, from teachers forced to abandon their language, from miners who see their wealth shipped to Moscow while their town falls apart. And that's what really scares Putin. His greatest fear isn't NATO, it's the Russian map itself. For 20 years, he built his power on the illusion of stability. He centralized everything, silenced dissent, and made sure every decision ran through Moscow. It worked for a while, but now the economy's struggling and the war's dragging on. And that old fear that kept people obedient is fading. What's replacing it is far more dangerous to the Kremlin: belief. The belief that they might not need Moscow anymore. The belief that they could walk away and stand on their own. So when you put it all together, the suppression of culture, the exploitation of resources, and the human cost of the war, you start to see the full picture. These aren't separate issues. They're connected fault lines running through every part of Russia's foundation. Each one makes the others worse. A young man from Tuva loses his language, loses his land to mining, then loses his brother in a war that he never wanted. When he comes home, he doesn't see Moscow as his capital anymore. That's exactly how rebellion starts. Unless something changes, Moscow may one day wake up to find that its empire has quietly started to slip away. All of this anger didn't appear out of nowhere. It's the echoes of centuries of control, of an empire that never really ended. To understand why Russia keeps fracturing, you have to look further back, not to Putin or even to Stalin, but to the moment Moscow decided it was born to rule. What began as a small, cold principality grew through a mix of ambition, paranoia, and brutality. Russia didn't just conquer its neighbors, it swallowed them whole. Tatars, Chechens, Buryats, Yakuts, and dozens more were pulled under the banner of protection, even as towns burned and languages vanished. Conquest wasn't just about land, it was about forcing everyone into the Russian world, shaping identity itself. And every conquest left a scar. Tatars and Bashkirs never forgot their lost khanates. The Caucasus became a permanent war zone. And in Siberia, indigenous people were pulled into an empire under the guise of civilization, which often looked a lot like slavery. Russia ruled not with trust, but with fear, always watching for rebellion. This expansion wasn't just about greed. It came from a place of fear. Without moving forward, Russia could be conquered. Geography shaped this mindset a big deal. There were endless plains, no natural borders, and enemies on every side. To feel safe, the empire felt that it had to keep advancing. By the 19th century, this sense of destiny hardened into policy. The Tsars didn't just rule a country, they ruled a belief. Moscow was chosen by God to unite all Slavs and beyond. And that mission came at a terrible cost. Millions crushed under the weight of one empire. Then came 1917. The Tsar was gone, but the empire didn't die. The Soviet Union promised liberation, but delivered control. Stalin turned every republic into a puppet, tolerated local languages only when convenient, and made sure leaders obeyed or disappeared. Fear, not faith, held the empire together. The Soviet Union sold the world an image of brotherhood and equality. The real message was always the same. Unity meant obedience. People gave everything to the state and got slogans in return. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the scars didn't vanish, they just changed names. Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltics broke free, but dozens of smaller nations stayed trapped inside of Russia, still feeding its ambitions. Putin came promising stability, but what he built was a quieter version of the same empire. In his eyes, the chaos of the 1990s proved that too much freedom was dangerous. To fix this, he re-centralized power, erased regional independence, replaced the Soviet flag with the tricolor, and swapped ideology for nationalism. At the end of the day, Moscow still took, and the regions still obeyed. Governors who used to be elected became appointees of Moscow. Local constitutions were rewritten to match federal law. Even Tartastan's special status ended in 2017, erasing its last symbol of autonomy. What we are seeing now isn't a new rebellion. It's history repeating itself. An empire cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. Crazy how much life repeats itself when you zoom in on the key moments. So, when Putin says Russia is indivisible, what he really means is that Russia's regions are too scared to leave, for now. Fear, though, it doesn't last forever. It holds until something stronger breaks it. And right now, that's exactly what's happening. The war in Ukraine, a collapsing economy, and rising local defiance are shaking the very foundation of the Russian Federation. The same empire that spent centuries swallowing others is now struggling to stop itself from falling apart. Now, if you really want to see how fragile things have become, you just have to look at where the fault lines are the deepest. From the mountains of the Caucasus to the frozen edge of the Arctic, whole regions are restless, angry, and tired of being ignored by Moscow. Let's start with the North Caucasus. Everyone knows Chechnya, and for good reason. After 2 brutal wars, it's now ruled like a personal kingdom by Ramzan Kadyrov, who publicly praises Putin while quietly building his own little empire. On paper, Chechnya looks loyal. In reality, that loyalty is just for show. Beneath the surface, resentment still runs deep. The scars from war, deportations, and destruction haven't healed. They've just gone quiet. Next door, Dagestan is even more volatile. It's one of the poorest communities, filled with complex ethnic and religious communities, and many families have lost men to the war. Protests erupt often, fueled by anger over mobilization and decades of neglect. Ingushetia and Kabardino-Balkaria face the same old story. Mistrust of Moscow, frustration at being ignored, and a lingering belief that the Kremlin only remembers them when they need soldiers. Move north and you find a different kind of tension in the Volga-Ural republics. Tartastan was once the pride of regional autonomy. It had its own constitution, language rights, and a unique deal with Moscow that gave it real independence. But that all ended in 2017, when Putin stripped those rights away. Bashkortostan followed with its own wave of anger, especially last year when huge protests broke out. There, nationalism mixed with environmental activism and anti-war sentiment, creating a movement Moscow couldn't easily dismiss. These places remind the Kremlin that separatism doesn't always need guns. Sometimes pride, culture, and economic ambition are enough to challenge control. Then there's Siberia in the Far East. These regions are vast and rich in resources. Yet, for all their wealth, locals see little in return. In Buryatia, mobilization hit hard, with some villages losing nearly all of their adult men. Many survivors fled abroad, forming exile groups in Mongolia and Europe that now push anti-war and pro-autonomy messages. Yakutia, or Sakha, sits on gold and diamonds. Yet locals watch outsiders profit while their rivers and forests are destroyed. Tuva, small and mostly non-Russian, was also drained by mobilization, with families paying a far heavier price than those in Moscow. And it's not just minority regions feeling restless. Cities like Chabarovsk and Vladivostok have grown more defiant too, embracing a kind of Siberian identity. Proud, self-reliant, and increasingly hostile to the idea of being ruled from thousands of kilometers away. Even the remote Arctic and the far north aren't immune. Indigenous peoples like the Nenets and the Chukchi are losing their lands to oil and gas projects. Their reindeer herding routes are destroyed, their fishing rights are ignored, and when they protest, arrests often follow. These are small communities, but the resistance carries weight. It shows that even in the coldest, most distant parts of Russia, people are starting to say, enough is enough. Then there's Kaliningrad and Karelia, both geographically cut off and culturally distinct. Kaliningrad sits between NATO countries, more European than Russian in attitude, and its people know it. Karelia, close to Finland, looks westward too. As Moscow tightens surveillance and slams down on local dissent, resentment only deepens. The farther you get from Kremlin, the less people feel tied to it, and the more they start imagining life without it. To add to all of this, religion runs deep in Russia's unrest, especially in the North Caucasus, where Islam keeps running headfirst into Moscow's control. In places like Dagestan and Chechnya, faith isn't just something people practice. It's part of who they are. It's their shield, their voice, their way of saying, hey, we're still here. When local clerics step up in mosques and call Moscow's war unjust, people listen. Those words spread fast, and before too long, you've got crowds in the streets. Meanwhile, the Russian Orthodox Church sits right at the center of power, hand in hand with the Kremlin. It's treated as the true faith, showered with funding and legal protection. But for Muslim communities, especially those trying to live by their own traditions or laws, it's a very different story. The state comes down hard. Moscow's been doing this for decades, sending in troops, shutting down religious schools, and silencing leaders. In the 1900s, it got so brutal that thousands were killed, leaving wounds that still haven't healed. That kind of force doesn't bring loyalty, it breeds resentment. People see their beliefs crushed, while orthodoxy is propped up as the national religion. The divide between city and countryside makes it all worse. In places like Kazan and Ufa, young activists use social media to talk about faith, culture, and the fight to keep their identity alive. Out of rural villages where poverty runs deep and schools are falling apart, people join that anger. But for them, it's not just about pride. It's about survival. Across all those regions, a pattern appears. They're either rich in culture or rich in resources, and both make them restless. They've endured cultural suppression, economic exploitation, religious abuse, and disproportionate military losses. Some express it through protests, others through quiet resistance, but the mood is the same: frustration and fatigue. The Kremlin's control feels heavy, distant, and undeserved. That is what makes this moment so dangerous for Moscow. The country might look united on paper, but underneath, it's under pressure. Cultural pride, economic frustration, and human losses are blending into a single powerful force. If the right spark hits at the right time, those cracks could turn into something much larger, something the Kremlin may no longer be able to control. And while Russia scrambles to hold its pieces together, there's one country watching closely: China. Because what's happening to Russia today is the nightmare that Beijing wants to avoid tomorrow. Like Moscow, China rules over diverse regions, from Xinjiang to Tibet, and it faces similar tensions over culture and resources. Russia's struggles are minor, reflecting challenges Beijing knows all too well, and a warning of what happens when resentment festers for too long. You see, both countries share a playbook. Moscow demands loyalty from Tatars, Buryats, and Chechens, pushing a single Russian world identity while sidelining local languages and traditions. China does the same, promoting Han Chinese cultures over Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Mongols. And schools and media tightly control and enforce one narrative. Much like Yakutia in Xinjiang, Rare earth minerals and cotton enrich Beijing. But local communities see little benefit. Rivers are polluted, lands are stripped, and people in both places feel like their homes are just resource colonies for the capital. Russia's unrest hits close to home for China, especially in places like Siberia and the Far East, where Chinese companies already invest heavily in oil, gas, and timber. If Moscow's control slips, Beijing could gain even more access to these riches. But it's a risky bet. A fractured Russia might inspire similar defiance in China's borderlands. Young people in Xinjiang, like those in Bashkortostan, use social media to share their frustrations, connecting local struggles to global ideas. When a protest in Dagestan goes viral, it doesn't just echo in Siberia, it reaches Urumqi as well. Beijing knows that suppressing culture or ignoring economic pain, as Moscow has done, can backfire. Russia's war in Ukraine has drained its economy and fueled anger in its regions. China faces no such war, but it sees the same pressure building in its own regions, where heavy surveillance and forced assimilation breed quiet resentment. If Russia's federation starts to crack, it could spark dangerous ideas in China's periphery, where people are already questioning why their wealth and identity are sacrificed for the center. For China, Russia's crisis is both a lesson and an opportunity. Beijing is learning that fear and control only hold an empire together for so long, but it also sees a chance to expand its influence, especially in Russia's resource-rich east, if Moscow's grip weakens further. The catch is balance. Too much chaos could bring instability to China's doorstep, with refugees or conflict spilling over. Russia's pain is a reminder that empires built on extraction and erasure, whether in Moscow or in Beijing, are never as solid as they seem. So, what happens if the cracks keep widening? There isn't just one ending here. Frankly, there are several, and none of them look peaceful. One possibility is something you might call controlled fragmentation. Here, regions are not demanding full independence yet. They just want to be treated fairly. They want control over their own budgets, schools that teach their own languages, and laws that reflect their culture. Tatarstan has long walked this line carefully, proud but pragmatic. Bashkortostan is another example, where anti-war sentiment, environmental activism, and cultural revival are forming a loud regional voice. In this scenario, tension grows slowly but steadily. Protests flare up when the Kremlin refuses to listen. Telegram channels buzz with updates. Exiled communities help spread the word abroad. Arrests happen, as they always do, but they only strengthen the movement. What starts as local demand can quickly turn into organized campaigns, petitions, and even referenda that Moscow struggles to contain. But controlled fragmentation rarely stays neat. Once one region wins language rights, another demands a share of oil and gas revenue. Another wants to exempt its young men from the next wave of mobilization. Each small victory inspires the next. On paper, Moscow may still hold the Federation together, but in reality, unity is fading. What once felt like a country now feels more like a collection of territories trying to escape gravity. Then there is the far messier scenario. A chaotic breakup. This is Moscow's nightmare. It could happen if the war drags on, the economy collapses, or a leadership vacuum opens up after Putin. Suddenly, the center cannot hold. Several regions declare independence at once. Local militias form to protect their communities. Some turn to the West for recognition, others to China or Turkey for support. Siberia could assert its own identity, while the Arctic and the Far East become battlegrounds for resources and influence. In that chaos, daily life collapses. Roads and railways stop working. Food and medicine stop moving. Hospitals close. Schools can't operate. Cities struggle to feed themselves. Borders become tense and unpredictable. The Arctic, rich in oil and gas, could easily turn into a conflict zone, where local fighters, Kremlin loyalists, and foreign powers all compete for control. And the ripple effects would not stay inside Russia. They would hit Europe, China, and the countries tied to Russia's trade. There's a third path, one that looks calm on the surface but is just as dangerous, a frozen empire. Here, Russia technically survives, but unity is dead. The Kremlin leans on propaganda, heavy military spending, and tight policing to keep people in line. Outwardly, the country seems stable, but resentment grows under the surface. Local leaders hold titles, but no real power. Protests don't disappear, they just go quiet. Young people will begin to look abroad for hope, not to Moscow. The state becomes a frozen river, solid on top, but currents of unrest moving underneath. The theme of this scenario is that obedience can be forced, but loyalty cannot. History offers plenty of warnings. Chechnya in the 1990s showed how a small conflict can spiral into a full-scale war. The Soviet Union's collapse proved that a state can appear stable right up until the moment it falls apart. Moscow knows these lessons, but that does not make them immune. History does not copy itself exactly. It echoes, building pressure until it finally bursts. One truth runs through all of this. Russia's federation is a pressure cooker that cannot hold forever. Moscow may look strong, but that strength is mostly an image. Every crackdown adds more heat. A young, connected generation sees beyond Moscow's borders, and the unraveling threads are spreading faster than ever. Russia today looks like an empire on the edge. Controlled fragmentation, chaotic breakup, or a frozen empire, none of these paths lead to stability. For decades, the Kremlin relied on fear, exploitation, and propaganda to hold the country together. Those tools are losing power, and the consequences could reshape the map for generations. But it's important to note that not every region wants to break away completely. Some are pushing for respect, influence, or cultural survival rather than full independence. Separatism isn't always about raising a new flag or drawing new borders. For some, it's about pride, about holding on to their language, traditions, or a say in their own future. Take Tatarstan, for example. This republic has long walked a careful line. The people are proud of their Turkic heritage, their language, and their history as a powerful khanate centuries ago. They push for more control over their budget and schools, but they're pragmatic. They want a better deal within Russia, not a divorce from it. Tartarstan's leaders negotiate with Moscow, balancing cultural pride with loyalty to keep the peace. It's a quiet push for autonomy, not a loud demand for independence. Now compare that to Dagestan. Down in the North Caucasus, the mood is far more explosive. Dagestan's a mix of dozens of ethnic groups, each with its own language and traditions, and they've been ignored by Moscow for years. Add to that the anger over sons being drafted into a war they don't support, and you get something raw and volatile. Protests there aren't just about language or budgets, they're about survival. Roads get blocked, clerics speak out, and young men dodge the draft in huge numbers. It's not hard to see why. When your home feels like a colony and your people are treated like cannon fodder, patience runs out fast. Dagestan's unrest isn't full of careful steps like Tatarstan. It's more explosive, and it's more about shaking Moscow's yoke off. These differences matter, because when Moscow's grip weakens, the world isn't just watching one type of rebellion, it's watching a mosaic of movements, each with its own risks and opportunities. That's why powers like China and the EU and Turkey are already taking note. We'll dive into that in just a second. And it's not just ethnic republics pushing back against Moscow's grip. Even in cities and regions where most people are ethnic Russians, the ground is starting to shift. Places like Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, far from the Kremlin's reach, are finding their own voices, driven not by cultural pride, but by a deep sense of being ignored. These aren't movements for new flags or languages. They're about fairness, survival, and a growing belief that Moscow sees them as little more than distant outposts. Take Khabarovsk, a city in Russia's far east, about as far from Moscow as you can get without crossing a border. In 2020, something snapped. The Kremlin arrested Sergei Furgal, the country's popular governor, on charges many locals called a sham. Furgal wasn't just a politician. He was a local hero who cut wasteful spending, fixed roads, and spoke for a region tired of being overlooked. His arrest felt like Moscow spitting in their faces. For weeks, tens of thousands poured into the streets, waving regional flags and chanting for local control. Some nights, the crowd hit 50,000 huge for a city of just over 600,000. They weren't calling for independence, but they were done with Moscow picking their leaders like a parent choosing a child's clothing. The protests faded after arrests and winter's chill, but the anger didn't. In 2024, smaller rallies popped up over rising fuel costs, organized on Telegram and VK, showing that Khabarovsk's spirit is still kicking. Locals now openly talk about Far Eastern pride, a quiet rebellion that says, we can do better without Moscow's leash. Then there's Vladivostok, Russia's Pacific port, closer to Tokyo than to Kremlin. This city calls itself the capital of the Far East, and it's not just bravado. With its bustling docks and trade routes, Vladivostok feels like a world apart, tied more to Asia than to Moscow's decrees. But life here isn't easy. Fishing, a lifeline for locals, is choked by regulations that favor big companies tied to Kremlin's insiders. In 2023, protests erupted when new quotas slashed local fishermen's catches, leaving families struggling to eat, while Moscow's elite raked in profits. Fuel prices didn't help, doubling in parts of the Far East while wages stayed flat. The average worker in Vladivostok barely earns half of what Moscow workers do, heightening that tension. Small but fiery demonstrations have since flared up, often shared online with hashtags like #FarEastFirst. These aren't ethnic revolts like in Dagestan, they're about a region fed up with being treated like a colony, its wealth siphoned west while its roads crumble and its jobs vanish. What's striking about these places is how their anger mirrors the ethnic republics but wears a different face. In Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, it's not about language or heritage, it's about being heard. These regions feel like they're carrying Moscow's weight without getting a say. They see their taxes flowing to the capital, their resources feed distant elites, and their voices are drowned out by a government 7,000 kilometers away. It's no wonder they're starting to ask, why do we even need Moscow at all? That question, bubbling in cities once thought loyal, shows just how wide Russia's cracks are spreading. As you keep flipping the pages, you see that the cracks in Russia's foundation aren't just about angry regions or a struggling economy. They're tied to what's happening at the very top, in the Kremlin. Putin has ruled for over 2 decades, centralizing power so tightly that almost every major decision runs through him. But he won't be there forever, and the question of who comes next is starting to stir trouble. Without a clear successor, Russia's elite, including oligarchs, security chiefs, and regional bosses, are quietly jockeying for influence. This behind-the-scenes power struggle could change everything for the regions pushing back against Moscow. Right now, Putin's grip keeps the system together, but it's brittle. If he steps down or something happens to him, the fight to replace him could split the Kremlin's focus. Some elites might push for harsher crackdowns to keep regions like Dagestan and Tatarstan in line, sending in more troops or tightening the laws. Others might see a chance to loosen the reins, offering local budgets or language concessions to calm unrest. Either way, the regions won't sit quietly. A distracted Moscow could give places like Bashkortostan and Yakutia the opening they need to demand more autonomy or even just break away. And interestingly, the elite rivalries are already starting to bubble. Security bosses in the FSB want more control and surveillance, while some governors and business tycoons push for deals that keep regions loyal but give them more power. In 2024, whispers of tension between Moscow's inner circle and regional leaders like Tartarstan's governor surfaced when a budget dispute stalled. These fights deepen the fault lines, and regions are taking notice. A house divided does not stand for long, and Russia's regions know it. But it's not game over just yet. Moscow isn't just sitting back watching these fault lines grow. It's fighting hard to keep the regions in line, and it's not always with riot police or propaganda. The Kremlin has a playbook for this, one it's been refining for decades. One of its go-to moves is co-opting local elites. In places like Tatarstan, where cultural pride runs deep, Moscow picks influential leaders such as business tycoons, religious figures, or local politicians and brings them into the fold. These elites get lucrative contracts, political favors, or fancy titles in exchange for keeping their communities loyal. Take Chechnya's Ramzan Kadyrov. He's built a personal empire with Moscow's cash, strutting around as Putin's loyal ally while running his region like a private fiefdom. That's a deal that works, for now. Kadyrov gets power, Moscow gets stability, but it's a tightrope. If the money dries up or loyalty wanes, that stability could crumble fast. With Ukraine draining Russia for all of its worth, we might see that drying up happening soon. Then there's the economic carrot. The Kremlin knows anger often comes from empty wallets, so it dangles targeted investments to calm restless regions. In Bashkortostan, after last year's protests, Moscow fast-tracked funding for new schools and roads, a clear attempt to buy goodwill. Yakutia saw a similar move in 2024, with a small bump in local budget shares from diamond profits. Not enough to fix poverty, but just enough to quiet the loudest critics. These aren't grand gestures. They're calculated bribes to keep protests from spreading. The catch is that people notice when the cash stops flowing, and resentment creeps back stronger than before. Moscow also plays the culture card, but it's a tricky one. In some regions, it allows small concessions, like letting Tatar schools teach a few hours of their language, to ease tensions without giving any real power. It's a way to look generous while keeping tight control. But when that fails, the Kremlin flips to intimidation. Surveillance ramps up, activists get mysterious visits from security services, and local media suddenly pushes Moscow's narrative even harder. In Dagestan, where protests keep flaring, the government has flooded social media with pro-Russia messaging, while quietly arresting influencers who stray too far from the script. It's a mix of charm and fear, designed to keep regions just obedient enough to hold the Federation together. The problem is that these tactics are starting to wear thin. Co-opted elites can only control so much when entire villages are grieving their lost sons. Economic bribes don't stick when hospitals still lack medicine, and cultural concessions feel hollow when Moscow's boot is still on the ground. The Kremlin is scrambling, but every move seems to create new cracks as fast as it patches the old ones. Now, interestingly, Russia's problems aren't just shaking the Kremlin, they're drawing eyes from across the globe. As Russia's regions push back against Moscow's grip, the ripples aren't just felt at home, they're catching eyes across the globe. From Europe to Asia, other powers are watching closely, and some are already positioning themselves to gain from Russia's cracks. We've already spoken about China and what it stands to gain and also lose if Russia collapses, but China's not the only one with a stake in this fight. Europe's nervous too. The EU depends on Russian gas and oil, and a crumbling federation could spike energy prices in Germany or Poland. Some in Europe might quietly back places like Kaliningrad, nestled between NATO allies, to gain leverage. But a chaotic Russia risks spilling refugees and conflict across borders. Turkey's eyes are locked on Russia's Turkic regions, like Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, where shared language and heritage create a natural bond. Ankara is quietly boosting cultural programs, funding language schools and festivals to strengthen ties with these communities. It's also offering diplomatic support, hosting exiled activists, and raising their concerns in international forums. This isn't just goodwill. Turkey sees a chance to grow its influence in a fracturing Russia. But it's a risky move. Stirring unrest could spark similar tensions in Turkey's own volatile regions, making Ankara tread carefully while still eyeing a bigger role on the global stage. Russia's crisis could redraw the global map, with China, Europe, and Turkey weighing rewards against the risk of a nation pulling itself apart. There is so much at stake in this dance. When all of this is said and done, the lesson is the same one that history always teaches. When culture is suppressed, resources are exploited, and loyalty is demanded without fairness, rebellion becomes inevitable. Fear can buy time, but not loyalty. The state can silence dissent, but it cannot erase anger. What remains is a federation that looks whole, but is crumbling from within. At this point, the cracks are spreading faster than Moscow can contain them. The question is not if the reckoning will come, but when, and in what form. You've probably noticed this already, but every time we try to show you what's actually happening on the front lines of this war, YouTube either demonetizes the video or just flat out blocks it. We've had videos taken down for simply showing the truth. Not propaganda, not fake clips, but verified footage analyzed with the help of real veterans. Meanwhile, the same mainstream media that claims to care about transparency won't even show you what Russian missiles are really doing to Ukrainian cities. That's why I built Basics Insider, our own platform, completely independent from YouTube and free from censorship. It's where we share frontline clips, deep analysis from veterans, and reports you'll never see on mainstream news. This isn't about clicks or views. It's about documenting the truth before it disappears behind the algorithms and the politics. And the only reason we're able to keep this website running is because of you, the fans, the viewers, the people who actually care about what's happening. We don't have sponsors, we don't have corporations backing us, just your support. So, if you believe in independent journalism, if you want to see what's really happening, go to basicsinsider.com right now. You can also click on the link in the description or scan the QR code on your screen. Because the war isn't just being fought on the battlefield, it's being fought for the truth.